beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to the video. Within this video guide I will be sharing my recipe and methods for brewing my tried and tested recipe for what I call Verdant Tropical Paradise IPA. It has certainly been a while since I released anything else using this great yeast, because I simply wanted to develop something on a similar standard and take a different approach altogether to really showcase this yeast in a different light. So here it is. Let's get started. Here is a sneak preview of my recipe's vital statistics. This recipe offers almost 6.5 ABV and is full of fresh citrus, apricot and bright tropical fruit flavours with a nice level of resin and pine. More on this later. With a BU-GU ratio of just 0.78, this is certainly having some bite to it without being old school IPA bitter. This recipe, like all of my shared recipes, is written by me and can be found in full within the video's description, which can be found underneath the video window when viewed on a desktop computer. You will also find a link to the full recipe on Brewfather here too, which can be used free of charge with some restrictions. For the very best of results, and so that you're actually brewing the recipe as intended, I strongly suggest that your initial steps will be to convert the recipe before ordering in your ingredients. I have an easy guide to doing this using Brewfather on my channel as shown on screen now. Within this video guide, this recipe is being brewed using a Grainfather G40 to the volume of 19 litres or approximately 5 US liquid gallons, but as part of the conversion process this can be scaled and shaped to suit your brewing system and volume requirements. Recipe conversion is an essential part of the process. Do note that this applies to all recipes you will obtain from others though, not just mine. I also strongly recommend that you plan your water profile ahead. After all, beer is mostly water and its balance is very important. If you're a beginner then don't worry too much about this, but this is certainly an important direction to move into for the very best of results. Shown on screen is the water profile that I use when developing this recipe, which is found on Brewfather, which is simply ideal for moving forward hop bitterness and dryness. If you have a hoppy profile that you prefer, then by all means use that instead, but this is certainly a very popular one. Let's now move on to the brew itself, starting with the mash, which begins by adding our grain gradually into our brewing system, which I will demonstrate whilst we look at what this is made up of. For our main grain bill we have a split of Munich Malt and Pilsner Malt, which are both added at 48% of our grist. Our Munich Malt is going to provide some more extra flavour and aroma which is malty. Its more subtle notes will be lost within the hop flavour for most, but if you have a sensitive taste palate then you may pick up some caramel and bready flavours too. The Pilsner Malt is adding in a crispness that works really well for this recipe, which in my test batches was swapped for from Pale Ale Malt. We then have 3% of wheat malt, which is adding to body and head retention along with some texture. Our 1% Carapils works a little further to provide a touch more body and head retention. At one point of this recipe's evolution I had simply 5% wheat malt, but this final mix simply worked better, so here it is. I also want to add that during doughing in I was not totally satisfied with the mash consistency, so I added in some sparge water here. This may not be the case for you as frankly grain does vary, but the takeaway here should be that the mash consistency is important. You are looking for a mash that is thin enough to stir easily enough, but thick enough not to be like an Asian style watery soup, which personally I find delicious, but we simply do not want that for our mash. Imagine a regular bowl of porridge or oatmeal and you are on the right track here. This is neither thin nor thick, a nice happy medium as it were. Once your extra water is added, then I suggest breaking up the grain further to ensure that every single grain is wet. It was then time to start the mash, which I have increased in speed as the G40's gradual spread of mash water through the grain bed is a fun one to watch as it progresses. Shown on screen is the mash schedule for this one, which is very much a cookie cutter profile these days due to how well modified grain is. Some homebrewers like to skip mash out, but I personally advise against this as mash out does a great job at uncompacting our grain bed, which assists with our sparge, which is coming next. I then lifted the grain basket and performed a sparge manually by hand using a 5 litre jug with preheated water at 75 degrees Celsius, which is our mash out temperature. This was done as evenly as possible to capture all of those converted sugars that are caught within the grain. Again, some homebrewers like to skip this step too to save time, but this will come at the cost of efficiency. I would say that if you have to rush a brew, then you'd be better off waiting to brew on a day when you actually have time for it. Certainly there are ways to speed up your brew without impacting the end beer though, this just isn't one of them. While I wait for my brewing system to heat up now to boiling temperature, I dispose of my grain and give the grain basket a clean down with a hot hose. It will then go into the system later for a chemical clean to finish off. As this one came to the boil, this beautiful protein head formed, which I sadly had to stir in to avoid a boil over. The technique here is simply a skimming stir that encourages the head to drop, revealing the wort underneath. I would urge you against removing this because you will be removing a segment of the intended recipe. Let's now look at the boil schedule. As my regular viewers are accustomed to, I am using the modern 30-minute boil here to reduce boil off of flavour. Yes, by doing this you will also save time and electricity too, but extra flavour is my primary reason to do this. If you are new to this concept, then please check out the video shown on screen for a full explanation of why longer boils were used in history and why the 30-minute boil is the new standard for modern brewers. This recipe uses the Australian hop Topaz alongside the American Centennial, which is certainly a very well proven pairing that provides a strong citrus base along with many tropical fruit flavours like lychee and sweet green fruit, as well as tangerine and clementine orange. There is also a very interesting level of resinous pine with input from both hops, which is an important aspect to this recipe's design. For those very experienced with American hops, this will taste very familiar and new all at once, with the aromatic qualities driving the taste further forward. All of our hops here are added in the last 15 minutes of the boil at 5-minute intervals to push both flavour and aroma, and finish with a 15-minute hop stand of the pairing, which is certainly a progressively contemporary method. To reduce the wort temperature down for the hop stand, I recommend the use of a fast immersion chiller. Personally, I love those by Jaded Brewing as shown, and it reduced this wort from boil temperatures to 80 in less than 1 minute. I then removed the chiller and added the finishing hops, ensuring that they were well stirred in. The hop stand time was started the moment I added the hops. When it came to transfer after the hop stand, I switched back to the Grainfather supplied counterflow chiller, which I had pre-sanitized earlier during the boil by running boiling hot water through it for a few minutes. After cooling, I started transfer and pitch. This recipe uses 2 different types of yeast, so as such is a co-fermentation. Naturally, Verdant IPA yeast is used for its very good flavour and aromas, which is very tropical with a great deal of tasty apricot. However, on its own within this recipe it was clear that more attenuation was needed, and I called on Fermentis US-05 for this job, as its attenuation is certainly more assured to be dry, which really benefits the overall beer in this case. If you struggle to find Verdant IPA yeast, then by all means substitute it for another British fruity yeast if you really have to, but be warned, this recipe was written around Verdant, so it will certainly be a sizable compromise. Naturally, US-05 is always very easy to find, but can be subbed by various other types of yeast that do a similar job. The choice is yours there. As you'll have seen already, my first job after pitching my yeast is to quickly cover it with cold water to speed things up nicely. Shown on screen is the fermentation temperature that I recommend for this one, and due to having US-05 present, there should be no need to increase temperature at the end to ensure full attenuation, as we would usually do with Verdant due to its often slow finish, but feel free to raise to 23 degrees Celsius or approximately 74 degrees Fahrenheit over 3 days if you wish to be on the safe side. In terms of using pressure, I would strongly suggest against it, at least for the first 4 days, to ensure that Verdant can contribute its Hester magic, but after this point you can certainly apply up to 1 bar of pressure, which is the yeast industry's consensus on the maximum pressure to use for fermentation, though my recommendation would be up to 0.83 bar or 12 psi for the best results, and this is of course just in my opinion. Once your fermentation has reached the point of having just 5 to 10 gravity points left, I would recommend that you then add in your dry hops. I suggest that you have a maximum contact time of 5 days, but 3 days is actually plenty enough. I have tried all methods of dry hopping, but frankly nothing so far has had as good results, and there is no need to buy a book either. The very most important thing here is to keep things clean and sanitary, so here is a guide to doing that in a way that has never failed me so far in hundreds of brews. In this example I'm going to use a hop sock, but the procedure is similar with other container types. This starts with boiling the bag. I strongly recommend doing this no matter if the bag has been previously used and cleaned, or if it's a brand new one straight out of the packaging. I then add this bag into a clean container and add sanitizer as a further safeguard. This will be the same container that I used to load the hops into. Once the sanitizer has had at least 3 minutes contact time, then this is then removed. After this point I then wash and sanitize my hands, and this is repeated if I need to touch the bag after touching anything that is not clean and sanitary. These are very important steps to avoid contamination, which is all too common when it comes to homebrewers making IPAs because of this step. I then carefully add the dry hops with the bag lining the container, being sure that nothing touches the bag except for the hops. Once you have loaded all of your hops into the bag, then be sure to tie a nice strong knot to keep all of the hops contained. This loosely fitting hop bag, so there is room to expand, can now be added into your fermenter. Let's now look at the end beer from this particular brew along with my tasting notes, starting with a close-up look at the pour here and then the same pour with a focus on the full glass. As you can see, the beer is actually a rather nice gold on the pour, but a hazy orange in bulk in the glass with a fresh white head. The real life colour is more pleasing to the eye than what you actually see here, but hey, beer is for drinking anyway. I have made no attempts to clear this beer, but that choice is of course yours. This beer has been in the keg for about 3 weeks at the point that you see it here, and has been under 12 psi of pressure, which is 0.83 bars, and I'm also using this pressure for serving too. Here are my tasting notes, starting with aroma. The aroma here is strongly citrus with a variety of tropical fruit flavours and that signature shot of apricot from Verdant IPA yeast. There is also a very refreshing contribution of resinous pine in the background too. This beer is very crisp and easy on entry with those pine notes coming in through the nose and taste buds. There is a wide range of fruit here just after entry with tropical fruit including pineapple, stone fruit as well as sweet green fruit like jackfruit and lychee and melon, but the strongest force here is certainly the citrus orange and apricot, which holds it all together very well. These different fruit flavours come in waves as you progress down the glass. This finishes with a satisfying level of bitterness bite at the end that is a little bit citric but without being sour in any way. I also have the following notes. This is certainly a crisp tasting beer, and it also has a balanced body and good head retention. This beer is very juicy and fruity, but different to the versions I come across from Europe and the US, mostly due to those awesome Aussie Topaz hops, which work really well in this mix, with US hops and British yeast. My final impression here is that this is a very varied, fruity IPA with very nice resinous pine that has some differences that make it a refreshing and interesting change from the run-of-the-mill IPA beers. I would certainly love to hear your thoughts on this video and also your impressions of the end beer should you brew it via the comment section of this video. I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!